Hey guys, this week we're talking about feet.
No! The feet of the Assyrians.
Oh, the feet of the Assyrians. Oh, yeah, that makes more sense. The feet of the Assyrians is what we're going to be talking about.
Defeat. They were conquered. They lost the battle.
The feet of the Assyrians. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, let's talk about that instead. Hey guys, and welcome to this week's Sabbath School Short. My name's Andrew, and we're diving into lesson number 7 this week. With the memory text opening up Isaiah chapter 37, verse 16, it says, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, the one who dwells between the cherubim, you are God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. And this week, we're talking about the defeat of the Assyrians. So let's look into Sabbath afternoon's lesson at this quote here that I really liked. It says, this series of pictures, which once adorned the walls of Sennacherib's palace without a rival, are now in the British Museum. And what a story they have to tell about the plight of God's professed people. And the Sabbath afternoon's lesson kind of tells about all of these different accounts of Sennacherib's conquerings, who was the king of Assyria, and how he conquered a lot of different lands, and it kind of brings up all of these different quotes and stuff from people that were conquered, and how this palace without a rival is one of his palaces that had all these pictures where it showed all of these defeated kingdoms that Sennacherib took. So this week we're going to look at how Sennacherib never actually took Jerusalem and how he fell at Jerusalem, which is really interesting. So let's dive into this by looking at Sunday's lesson, which is titled Strings Attached. And the quote that it really jumped out at me here, it says, just as important as military and organizational leadership, Hezekiah provided spiritual leadership as he sought to boost the morale of his people at this frightening time. But the king of Judah had determined to do his part in preparing to resist the enemy, and having accomplished all that human ingenuity and energy could do, he had assembled his forces and had exhorted them to be of good courage. And that's a quote from Ellen White, Prophets and Kings, page 351. And this is the point that I think that Sunday's lesson brings out, is that Hezekiah, who was king at the time of Assyria, was kind of marching through, and Hezekiah was the king at the time. How Hezekiah, he didn't just sit back with his faith, but rather his faith actually caused him to go out and take action and trust that God was going to do something through his action. So he strengthened his military, he set up all of these different things so that when Assyria came to them, he could be prepared. And it wasn't a faith where he just sat back and did nothing, but it was a faith that caused him to action so that he could trust God that he was going to do something through his actions. And so looking over at Monday's lesson, which is titled Propaganda, the quote that I really like there, it says, the Rapshakeh made some rather powerful arguments. You cannot trust Egypt to help you because she is weak and unreliable. You cannot depend on the Lord to help you because Hezekiah has offended him by removing his high places and altars throughout Judah, telling the people to worship at one altar in Jerusalem. In fact, the Lord is on Assyria's side and told Sennacherib to destroy Judah. You don't even have enough trained men to handle 2,000 horses. To avoid a siege in which you have nothing to eat and drink, give up now and you will be treated well. Hezekiah cannot save you, and because the gods of all the other countries conquered by Assyria have not saved them, you can be sure that your God will not save you either. And it's telling this point in Isaiah chapter 36, when this Rapshakeh, he was kind of a high officer from Assyria, showed up to Jerusalem and started yelling at the people, telling them all these reasons why they should be fearful, why Assyria was going to conquer them, and using this kind of propaganda, which is what the Monday's lesson is titled, to kind of scare them into thinking that they were going to be conquered. And the reason why his arguments were so valued was that they were mostly true. There was a lot of truth in what he was saying. He had just come from Lachish, which was a very strong fortified city, and that fell to Assyria. And there was many other cities that had fallen to the Assyrians as well. And so a lot of what he was saying had a lot of truth behind it. And Hezekiah did remove all of these things that he said. But the real question was, had all of this really offended God? So much so that God would not save them. Well, that question gets answered in the next lesson. So let's turn to that, looking over at Tuesday's lesson, which is titled Shaken but Not Forsaken. I really like that title, Shaken but Not Forsaken. And the quote that jumped out at me there, it says, Sennacherib had pointedly attacked Hezekiah's strongest defense, faith in his God. Rather than buckling under, Hezekiah appealed to God to demonstrate who he is, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. And this is Hezekiah's response, such a great example for us today, that he repeatedly turned back to God, even in the moments when his enemy was attacking God himself, was attacking his very faith, but he kept turning back to God over and over again, and he never really strayed from that, except at the end of his reign, but we'll talk about that later. In fact, in Hezekiah's prayer to God, which is the first part of it is in the memory text, but the second part I really want to read to you, Isaiah chapter 37, verses 18 through 20. It says, "Lord, it is true that the kings of Assyria have devastated all these countries and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but made from wood and stone by human hands. So they have destroyed them. Now, Lord, our God, save us from his power, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, Lord, are God, you alone." And this idea that Hezekiah just kept repeatedly turning back to God and recognizing that God was real and that God would protect Jerusalem if God wanted to. And so then looking over at Wednesday's lesson, which is titled "The Rest of the Story," this quote that jumped out at me, it says, "But in spite of his penchant for propaganda as an extension of his monumental ego, neither in text nor in pictures does he claim to have taken Jerusalem. From a human point of view, this omission is amazing, given the inexorable power of Sennacherib and the fact that Hezekiah led a revolt against him. Rebels against Assyria had short life expectancies and gruesome deaths." Inexorable power. Sorry, couldn't really read that word at first. But inexorable power of Sennacherib, right? He was super powerful, he was super strong, but nowhere does it mention that he ever took Jerusalem. And this miracle had taken place. God protected the walls of Jerusalem. It would have been interesting to see probably that picture, right? That the original story that started this whole lesson talked about in his hall there. Jerusalem was not there. And this other quote from this lesson that jumped out at me from Ellen White, Prophets and Kings, it says, "The God of the Hebrews had prevailed over the proud Assyrian. The honor of Jehovah was vindicated in the eyes of the surrounding nations. In Jerusalem, the hearts of the people were filled with holy joy." And this just reminded me of the verse in 1 John 4:4 that says, "Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world." We don't have to fear the enemy because God is on our side. And just as God protected Jerusalem from Assyria back in the day when Hezekiah turned to him, we can have faith in knowing that if we turn to God and trust in him, we can be safe from the enemy, and that we'll be taken up with him in the clouds when he comes again, and I can't wait for that day. So looking over at Thursday's lesson, which is titled "In Sickness and in Wealth," kind of talking about this opportunity Hezekiah had to show God, but rather turn to his pride. And the quote that really jumped out at me, it says, "Now we know why God chose this particular sign. Just as he later used the Star of Bethlehem to bring wise men from the east, he used the solar shift to bring messengers from Babylon. This was a unique opportunity for them to learn about the true God. Merodach Baladan spent his entire career trying to win lasting independence from Assyria. He needed powerful allies, which explains his motivation for contacting Hezekiah. If the sun itself moved at Hezekiah's request, what could he do to Assyria?" And this is talking about when Hezekiah was actually very, very sick. And this event took place very close to the time God delivered Hezekiah from Sennacherib, but he was very sick and he pleaded with God and asked God to give him more life, and God grants him that request and gives him 15 more years. And the sign that God says would happen, that this would take place, was that he would move the sun back on the sundial. And this is interesting to note because the Babylonians were people who studied the stars and were very intelligent at that, so they probably noticed the sun moving back a little bit as this miraculous sign took place. So then they went to Hezekiah, hearing that it was because of him that the sun went back, thinking that they could rally with him. But instead of Hezekiah showing them God and who he was and his power and his might, he decided instead to show them all his riches and all his glory and all his power and everything that he had accomplished. And unfortunately, this pride took over Hezekiah's heart, and instead of showing God to them, he showed his wealth and all of these things, which eventually Babylon took over, and the people of God were in their care. Not in their care, but I'm blanking on the word. They were under captivity. There it is. Under captivity for Babylon, right? And that's the unfortunate thing here. And Friday in the further thought section kind of unpacks this through an Ellen White quote. It says, "But pride and vanity took possession of Hezekiah's heart, and in self-exaltation he laid open to covetous eyes the treasures with which God had enriched his people. The king showed them the house of his precious things, the silver and the gold, the spices, the precious ointment, and all the house of his armor, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah showed them not." Isaiah chapter 39, verse 2. "Not to glorify God did he do this, but to exalt himself in the eyes of the foreign princes." And that's in Prophets and Kings, pages 344 to 345. But kind of what this lesson talks about is that Assyria never got through to Jerusalem because King Hezekiah always turned back to God and pleaded with God. Even though at the end of his reign, he lost sight of that and turned to his pride rather than God, God honored him when he turned to him. And so I want to encourage you today, with whatever's going on in your life, turn to God and trust that greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And you don't have to fear the enemy, for God is on your side if you turn to him and ask for his help. So I hope you guys enjoyed this week's Sabbath School Short. As always, if you could give a thumbs up for this video, subscribe to Advent Blueprint, drop in the comments down below. What has your experience been as you've been turning to God for help? Has it been difficult? Has it been challenging? Has it been easy? What's your journey been like turning to God for his help? We hope to see you guys on next week's Sabbath School Short, and we'll see you then.